Today's guest is John Dyer. John is president of his firm, John Dyer and Associates, located in Mooresville, North Carolina. John started his career at General Electric and later moved to Ingersoll-Rand, where he was VP of Operations for their Safety and Security Division. John had the benefit of learning directly from W. Edwards Deming, and we talk about his experiences learning from Dr. Deming in the famed 4-day seminar, which included going through the Red Bead Experiment. John is a frequent contributor to IndustryWeek.com and is the author of The Facade of Excellence, Defining a New Normal of Leadership. John is also frequently helping as a judge for IndustryWeek's Best Plants Award competition. John has a degree in engineering from Tennessee Tech University and an international MBA from Purdue University and the University of Rouen in France. Here's our guest, John Dyer. Okay, folks, we have John Dyer with us. John, we briefly touched on who you were in the intro, but can you tell us a little bit about yourself, your background, what you do, and how lean and continuous improvement is a part of your life?
Sure. First of all, thank you for having me. I really do appreciate the time. As far as my career, I consider myself to be one of the originalists when it comes to continuous improvement. Back in the mid-1980s, early in my career at General Electric, I got interested in this whole concept of process improvement and teamwork and getting employees engaged, enough to the point where the executives at GE asked me to put together the first of its kind dedicated team of resources to help drive continuous improvement in major appliances. That's where I was at the time. We had some pretty horrific failures, but we also had enough successes to where the executive said there must be something to this whole continuous improvement thing. And they asked me to go into one of those dream jobs where for 2 years I got the opportunity to travel the country, benchmark companies that were starting down this journey. I got the opportunity to spend time with Dr. Ed Deming and attend his training classes. I got the opportunity to go to Motorola University and sit through this original Six Sigma training with the people who actually designed the classes back before they gave out belts. Got to spend time with Stephen Covey and the Covey Institute in Utah back when 7 Habits was just starting to take off. So it was a great opportunity. And of course, they kept asking me to come back and educate them on what I had learned. So that's what introduced me to the concept of training and engaging adult education, that sort of thing, with some pretty high level folks. Well, finally they said, okay, John, you've learned a lot. We want to see if you can actually apply what you've learned. So they sent me to Bloomington, Indiana, where we made side-by-side refrigerators. And at that time, if you bought a GE side-by-side refrigerator, there was a 50% chance that it would break down under warranty. So when we talk about, Six Sigma levels of quality, we were far, far from that. But it was a very profitable product for us. So the head of major appliances said, John, we're going to send you to Bloomington. We're going to give you all the technical resources reporting directly into you. So all the quality engineers, inspectors, manufacturing engineers, industrial engineers. And we're going to give you a clean sheet of paper. You can change whatever you want about the structure of the plant, the organization, how we do things, the use of teams. Apply all the things that you've learned over the last couple of years. But this is one of our crown jewels, so whatever you do, don't screw it up. So that's the directive that I was given, and so when I went to Bloomington, we ended up changing everything. We changed the organizational structure. We started a new type of organization that actually put resources on the shop floor to work directly with the operators to help drive continuous improvement. That was their full-time job. So the way I like to put it is imagine taking a quality engineer, a manufacturing engineer, and an industrial engineer, combining those 3 groups together, and then saying this chunk of the process is your responsibility. Work with the people, learn it, learn what the problems are, listen to their ideas, and then you're being measured on how well that part of the process improves over time. And that was a huge success. We were able to really turn things around. And when I left about 3 years later, we had gone from 50% down to the low teens. And it was, a really nice steep graph going down. But Ingersoll-Rand heard what we had done, and they called me up one day and gave me an offer I couldn't refuse. They fully funded an international executive MBA if I would come to work for them. And we did the same things there. I took several plants within Ingersoll-Rand, and we used the same things that we had learned at GE and applied it in those plants and saw the same kind of results. So I was with Ingersoll-Rand for 10 years, worked my way up to a corporate VP role, responsible for driving Lean and Six Sigma on a global basis, and then decided to go out on my own. And I've been doing the consulting type role ever since. So really for over 15 years now. About 8 years ago, I started writing for a magazine called IndustryWeek, and several of my articles became very popular, one of which caught the eye of a publisher, and they asked me if I'd be interested in turning that into a book. And so I had my first book come out a short time ago, and so I can now add author to my name.
Outstanding. Well, John, we're grateful for you to be here today. We appreciate that synopsis of that journey. And one of the things that stood out to me when we were talking is I look on your LinkedIn page, and at the top of the header, you have a picture of you with Dr. Deming, and that was like, wow, that's original. That's not Photoshop. That's
Right.
that picture was taken before Photoshop existed. We always ask our guests to share with us a quote from someone that their favorite lean leader. Can you tell us what your quote is and how or why you chose it?
So as you mentioned, I'm a huge Dr. Deming fan. Not only do I have that picture on the wall in my office, but also I have a handwritten note that he gave me. When he found out that I was from General Electric, when I attended his training classes, he would come to me and during the breaks and strike up a conversation and want to know what we were doing and, that sort of thing. So really terrific person, a huge believer in all of these things that we're talking about. So that's where my favorite quote comes from, is from Dr. Deming, the one where he says, "A bad system will beat a good person every time." Too quickly, we tend to jump to the conclusion that it's someone's fault when something goes wrong versus taking a step back and really looking at the process, looking at the systems and saying, what allowed this to go wrong? Or could we have done any better than that operator if we were in their shoes, given the way that this process is designed? Dr. Deming, in his classes, he did the Red Bead Experiment. I got a chance to see him do that twice. And the second time, I knew that it was so profound that I ended up writing down every word he said, knowing that I was going to incorporate that in my training classes back when I got back to General Electric. And I have done the Red Bead Experiment, many, many, many times. But if you really look at what is the key learning point of that exercise, it's, you basically have a bowl full of beads mixed with white and red beads, and you're asking people to take a sample of beads out of that bowl, and you blame them for every red bead that they withdraw. Well, of course, it's random what beads you get, and there's enough red beads to assure you that you're going to get some red beads with every sample. So it basically reinforces this whole idea that if the process is broken and has a lot of red beads in it, there is no hope for the operator to do a good job every time, which leads to demoralization, frustration, lack of trust, almost a hateful attitude towards the leaders. And you can't build good team uh, initiatives with that kind of culture.
Yeah, I think the Red Bead exercise should be required learning for anyone that has to work in or set up a process in any type of environment, and because it teaches you, no matter what you do, if you have a bad process, you're going to get bad outcomes. And I also love the fact that you can take anybody in the room, whether they are, you know, have a PhD or if they are a junior in high school, you give them the same scoop, they do it the same way, they get the same, the same possibility of results, and it just proves that the human element isn't the element that you need to work on in order to improve the process. You need to improve the process element.
Exactly, and what's great about it is it transcends all organizations. So I've actually done the Red Bead Experiment with a group of government leaders, a group of leaders from nonprofits, even a group of pastors, and they get the same results. They get the same key learning. It's like, wow, we've never thought of it in quite this manner, that a bad process will beat good people every time.
Well, John, one of my goals for this podcast is to help other lean leaders resonate with your experiences. So, can you take us back, mid to late 1980s, and kind of tell us, why you chose this profession? Like, how did you know that when you were in that moment that this was the work that you wanted to devote your life to?
Well, and I actually highlight this story in my book, but basically it boils down to a time where I was a process engineer on second shift, and we were making top mount refrigerators in Louisville, Kentucky. And there was this key piece of equipment that when it went down, the entire production line would shut down. And so we had to make sure that it ran, all the time. Because when a line went down, I mean, we're talking hundreds of operators that would then become idle very quickly. And between our part of the process and the final assembly part of the process, there was this large storage queue that had about 4 hours worth of product in it at any given time. Now, these are refrigerators, so you can imagine this storage area was, larger than a football field of product on roller conveyors. We had 5 full-time employees that did nothing but push refrigerators up and down these conveyors. So this one particular evening, this piece of equipment stopped working. And the diagnosis from the maintenance folks was that a motor burned out. Well, of course, we didn't have the spare motor, so we had to call a supply company on the other side of Louisville and have a taxi drive in a replacement motor, which took time. Well, in the process of it being wired up, the panel that the motor was wired to was mislabeled. So when the switch was flipped, this puff of smoke came out the
Yeah.
back, and it quit working. So, of course, we had to get another replacement motor driven in by another taxi. They got it wired up correctly this time, flipped the switch, nothing happened. It turns out it was the gearbox that the motor was connected to. And when we opened up that gearbox, it was completely out of oil and had been for many, many months because the gears were ground down to nubs. And of course, we didn't have a replacement gearbox, so we had to get another gearbox driven in. And finally, we got the machine back up and running. The entire downtime was 6 hours. Well, the storage area only holds 4 hours, so we shut assembly down for 2 hours. And in this particular plant, that was considered, the most horrible sin. In fact, we calculated that for every day we were not making production, we lost $1 million. So
Oh, wow.
that's how critical this was. So the next day, of course, we have a big meeting to discuss what went wrong. And the plant manager at that time came into this meeting. His first words were, "Who are we going to fire?" And everybody just went into, complete silence, and, the defenses went up. And then, of course, the blame game started, and the deflection of the blame started. And finally, the head of operations said to the plant manager, he said, we just got unlucky. Here we've discovered a 6-hour problem and we only had 4 hours worth of inventory. We need to expand the storage area in order to get 6 hours of inventory. So if this ever happens again, we'll be covered. And everybody agreed that that was the right approach. And that was the end of the meeting. So afterwards, I sat down with my boss at the time, and I was just very confused. You've got to remember, I'm just a short time out of college. I'm still learning all these things. And I was just like, I don't understand. Why didn't we discuss why we didn't have the spare parts? Why didn't we discuss why the panel had been mislabeled? Why didn't we discuss why the gearbox was out of oil and why we weren't doing preventive maintenance clearly on this key piece of equipment? And do we really think that adding more inventory is the right answer? I mean, that's just going to drive up costs. We're going to have to add more people to manage all that product. And his answer was, hey, it's done. Don't rock the boat. The decision's been made. So that's when, the light bulb went off in my head that, wow, there's got to be more to figuring out how to make things work and how to improve things than just putting these Band-Aids in place versus really getting to the root cause of why these things are happening and fixing them permanently so they never happen again. That's the moment that I knew I wanted to get into this field of continuous improvement.
Fortunately, I had early in my career the opposite of that boss, where we had a similar issue, and he came into the room and he goes, "Guys, I'm going to take all the heat for this so that you have space to solve the problem." He goes, "But we can't have this problem again. So I need you to tell me everything that could have gone wrong and what we're going to do to fix it." But I remember, and it stuck with me, that moment where somebody said something similar to like, "Hey, we'll just grow this buffer," and he looked at that person and said, "Man, you sure can hide a multitude of sins with labor and inventory." He goes, "We're not going to do that." But he was right. You can. It's like a balm that very expensive balm, but it gives people a false sense of security when they're not solving a problem. They're just not. They're mitigating the problem from happening in the future by spending a lot of cash.
Exactly. And one of my favorite lines from my book is that good leaders don't believe in good or bad luck, only good or bad processes. Right? If you
So
really
true.
think about it, too often we talk about gremlins in the process, or, that we just had just really bad luck. But everything is assignable. There's a reason for everything. There's a cause for everything. And once we get over that hurdle to say, you know what, we can't just keep thinking that it's bad luck. We have to start identifying and addressing these issues and putting in permanent fixes instead of Band-Aids.
Exactly. Well, John, you explained it for us, the moment that was kind of the catalyst for, hey, there's a better way, and this is what I want to pursue. And you talked about early on a lot of the successes that you had with General Electric, and then led on to Ingersoll-Rand, and then your own consulting company. I have to imagine there had to be some moments where things did not work out the way that you wanted them to, maybe a setback or a pitfall that you experienced. Can you share with us what your moment was, that like a teachable moment that you learned the most from, where things didn't turn out the way you wanted them to?
Yeah, again, this was the one that first came to mind. Again, it was very early in my career. So I mentioned that the executives at GE, became interested enough in this to allow me to form this dedicated team of resources. And one of those teams I led. And so we decided to follow, Dr. Deming's teachings. And at that time, there's a guy by the name of Brian Joyner who wrote the team handbook. So we decided to follow their methodologies to to the nth degree. So we got the operators engaged. We formed a team. We did the plan, do, check, act. We mapped the process, and we wanted to make a pretty substantial change that would allow the process to run a lot smoother. But it did require a design change to the refrigerator. So we had to get a cross-functional team engaged. The design folks were involved. The R&D folks were involved. The supply chain folks were involved. So, this was a very large, multifunctional, multi-level team that I was heading up. And we did several pilot runs with this new design change, and everything worked great. The operators loved it. It made their job significantly easier. It took out a huge chunk of waste in the process. And we got everybody on the team to agree that this was the direction we needed to go. And we set a launch date. We launched this change. Everything worked great for about the first 4 hours. And then disaster hit. It turned out that the parts that we had to change, if you happen to be on the lowest end of the specification with one part and the highest end of the specification of the other part, that allowed just enough of a gap to where when we put the foam insulation into the refrigerator, it would find that little tiny gap and fill the entire cavity with foam. So all of a sudden, we had all these refrigerators being rejected because foam was coming out of every orifice, and it shut the entire system down. And I remember the plant manager, the same individual actually that headed up that production meeting, coming down to the shop floor in front of everybody and basically getting right in my face and just royally chewing me out right there on the spot for allowing this to happen. Now, what was great is my entire team was there with me, and they all stepped forward. I mean, these are representatives from every function within that plant. They all stepped forward and said, if you're going to chew him out, you got to chew all of us out too. And then he started to realize that, wow, this wasn't just done on a whim. We actually did follow a methodology. We had gotten everybody engaged. We had done the pilots. We had done all the things that we could to try to lessen the risk as much as possible. And he did the next day come out and apologize for chewing me out. So it was a disaster, but it reinforced the fact that if you do the right things, if you get the right people engaged, you can make a change happen. And actually, we were able to tweak it to address that one particular scenario, and we reinstituted the change a few days later, and it worked beautifully, and it stayed that way for years after that. And in fact, got written up as a huge accomplishment in the company newsletter and all that. So we finally did turn it into a win. But it just, again, reinforced the fact that, if you've got the right people engaged and you follow the right methodology, you can try to minimize risk as much as possible, but there's still that chance that there might be something that can go wrong. And then you just have to pick yourself up and keep plowing forward and make it work.
What I love about that story, John, is that you had a negative process outcome that had a negative person outcome in the form of that leader coming down and going into command and control style and chewing you out, but that your team, because you guys had established that credo as a team and that cohesion, that it actually produced a positive person outcome in that individual. And then ultimately the team was able to get a positive process outcome as well. So it would be really easy to say, hey, remember that time that John screwed everything up, but your team said, no, we own that together. It's not, John was just a piece of it. But then I guarantee that probably changed out the way that individual looked at process improvement work in the future instead of coming down and chewing you out.
Right. Well, and we talked about that some afterwards, many months later when things were really calmed down. And it was just like, hey, One of the things Dr. Deming talked about the most, of his 14 points in all the classes that I attended with him, he spoke the most about drive out fear. And if people are scared to death to make improvements happen, which requires a change to occur, you can't make an improvement without changing something. And change, by its very definition, does have an element of risk associated with it. So if you've created a culture and an environment that basically allows zero risk because of fear, then nothing will change and nothing will improve. So he understood at that point that if he hadn't come back out and apologized to me in front of all the same people that he had chewed me out the day before, then there would have been no more improvement from that point forward. And he came to that realization. So I did give him credit for that.
Well, you share with us the pitfall or the setback moment. What was the aha moment or the serendipitous moment where like, this is my life's work? This is the fun part, or it's maybe your favorite story about lean or continuous improvement.
Yeah, and again, I do highlight this in my book as well, that it's one of those days that I will always remember as my favorite day in manufacturing. So this was actually a plant in Ingersoll-Rand that, again, kind of went down that same path that I talked about with GE. When we first started, they were really struggling. If you ordered one of the products from this plant, it would take 12 weeks for you to receive it. And when you open the box, there was a 20% chance something would be wrong or missing or not functional. So, and the culture was not very good. In fact, the employees had just voted to unionize, and then when they realized how much the dues were, they de-unionized right after. But the issues were still heavy, hanging in the air, that caused them to want to unionize. Well, that's what I was walking into when I joined that particular plant. And we did a lot of the same things we had done at GE. We went and changed the entire organizational structure. We went to a team-based approach. We got all the employees, every single employee in that plant, trained in Lean and Six Sigma. We got everyone on teams. And over a 3-year period of time, we went from 12-week delivery times down to less than 2 days, up to a 99+% quality yield. Well, in this particular plant, we had also put in these scoreboards all throughout the plant that would give the operators real-time feedback on how the day was going. And it tracked several key metrics: a safety metric, a quality metric, an output metric, and what we call linearity, which is basically, are we making what the customer wants that day? Are we achieving the agreed upon schedule? Well, this particular day, I get a call in my office saying, you need to come out on the factory floor. It was about 10 minutes before the end of the shift. And I walk out there and I look up at the board, because we all did that. We all wanted to see what the scoreboard said. And at that particular time, every metric was at 100%, all the way down the board. That had never happened before in the history of this plant. So we're sitting there counting down the time to the end of the shift, hoping that we could achieve 100% for the entire day. And we did. We got to the end of the shift, the horn sounds, 100% all the way down the board. But what was very, very cool is what happened right after that. Here we are, here's a group of leaders standing there in the middle of the factory looking at the board. All of a sudden, we heard across the entire plant spontaneous applause as all the workers who had been involved in all these teams and who were engaged in making all these improvements happen and had that pride of workmanship, had that sense of accomplishment, recognized the huge achievement that this represented, and all erupted in cheering and applause. And I mean, it was one of those where you could see people's, tears streaming down people's cheeks, because it was just like one of these beautiful moments that are pretty rare, especially in manufacturing, to have occur. So that was the highlight of my career for sure.
That's such a great story. And what I love about that is that that applause was for the team. It wasn't for a group of leaders. It wasn't for an individual department. Like, you guys had created a situation where everybody had a sense of ownership over the results and the scoreboard. So it was kind of like at the end of a game when everyone has participated in a competition, and that hard work and the preparation and the training and those difficult days pay off, and you see it on a scoreboard. And what a hit of dopamine to see that 100% all the way down, because I guarantee the next day they're like, all right, let's do that again. That was really cool.
Right. Exactly. And again, we recognize that it wasn't luck. A lot of hard work went into making those things happen all throughout the factory. I mean, it was, like I said, it was a 3-year journey, and we had made some amazing improvements. I mean, these teams working together, being trained, being empowered, having the right resources engaged, were able to accomplish amazing results, and they continued on throughout. I got promoted soon after that. The person who took my place continued that journey. The person who went in after him continued that journey, and they became one of the shining examples within the corporation.
Outstanding story. John, in the course of your career, do you have a lean or continuous improvement pet peeve, or something you frequently see being applied or done wrong?
Well, actually, that's why I wrote my book, right? It's called The Facade of Excellence. And, I mentioned that I do articles for Industry Week. They also have an annual Best Plants competition, and I've been a judge for that for the last 8 years as well. So I get a chance to see a lot of data, a lot of write-ups from various companies, and have the opportunity to visit several plants. And I guess my biggest pet peeve is those who say they're doing lean, and then when you actually get into the plant, you realize it's a facade, right? That maybe at one point they were doing lean, but you'll see a Kanban square, let's say, painted on the floor, and where there's supposed to be one pallet of parts, there's now 10 pallets of parts stacked there. Or a shadow board that at one point served a purpose, and now it's almost completely empty of its tools, and nobody seems to care. So it's that lean fakery, to say, yeah, okay, we want to check the box off, versus really taking a step back and saying, okay, what do we fundamentally need to change in our culture, in our metrics, in the way the leaders respond to things, and how we engage our employees all the way through.
Yeah, I can echo that sentiment. It's something I've frequently seen in my career, where it's like you go to a facility and they take you in this room with all these pretty charts and dashboards, and they talk about their Obeya or their war room, and it looks really good in the room. But then you're like, all right, this is great. Let's go walk. Let's go for a walk. And you realize that it's a lot of vanity metrics. Like, it's easy to make things look really good in the room so that you won't walk out on the floor and see what's really going on. Or you keep identifying these issues, but you're not doing any of the real work. You're reporting the news as opposed to making it. It's something I've frequently seen as well.
Right, exactly. And I tell you, one of my favorite things to do, and you'll appreciate this, is when I go to visit a plant and they're like, "Yeah, we want to show you the last 3 Kaizen events that we've held and show you the results of those." And I'll be like, "Time out. No, no, no. I want to see a Kaizen event you did last year. Take me to that area and show me what the improvements were. Were they sustained? And have you built on those to make it even better than what it was after the event?" You'd be amazed at how many times people are like, "Oh, no, 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 we don't want you to go to
Yeah.
those areas." And then I
Sauce our
know at
eyes,
that
right?
point
Yeah.
it's all fakery, it's all a facade.
Well, John, what do you consider the most important thing that you've learned in your career journey so far?
I think The advice I would give to people who are wanting to get into the Lean Six Sigma field is dig deep. You know, dig deep in the knowledge. Don't just learn the tools. The tools are actually, if you think about it, pretty straightforward and not too difficult to learn. The methodologies are also fairly straightforward, maybe a little more difficult to put into action because, you have to really understand what the various steps are. But keep digging deeper. Dr. Deming talked a lot about you've got to understand the theory. You've got to understand, he called it profound knowledge. You've got to really understand what this is all about. And if you take that path, eventually you're going to realize that none of this works without the culture and leadership buy-in. And if the company is not willing to address those two critically important elements to Lean and Six Sigma, then it's not going to be sustainable. You might have a few short-term wins. You might have a few, things that happen to improve a little bit here and there, but eventually it's going to fall apart. So keep digging deeper in the knowledge of what truly makes Lean and Six Sigma work.
Great advice. I think that I love that idea of profound knowledge, but without the petri dish of culture and behavior and leadership in that environment, you can do all of the profound knowledge around tools that you can get. It's not going to stick. It's not going to work. It's not going to take root.
Right, exactly.
Well, John, you talked to us about someone that's starting out in their career. What about somebody that's a little bit further along in their Lean and Six Sigma journey? What advice would you offer to them? Maybe something that one of your peers offered you advice on recently.
Right. Again, it's basically to keep learning, keep digging. There are some really great organizations out there that people can tap into. AME is a good example, Association for Manufacturing Excellence. There are many, many resources online. So don't ever lose that feeling of needing to learn more. You can do benchmarking type exercises for different plants. Find a plant. It doesn't even need to be in your industry. In fact, it probably won't be in your industry. But find an organization that has really figured this out and go learn from them. Now, it's more than just trying to copy them, and I think that's one of the mistakes a lot of people make. A lot of people try to copy Toyota as an example without really understanding the fact that Toyota has decades of history behind it. They have a culture from Japan that's significantly different than the culture in the U.S. So you can't just copy someone. You've got to go in and learn what made it happen, and then, like I said, learn the theory, and then say, okay, how do we adapt that theory to make it successful within our own organization?
Great advice. Field trips in a pandemic era or post-pandemic era are a little more difficult than in a pre-pandemic area, but I know that there are a lot of organizations out there. I think about Jeff Koss at Koss Tailored. They offer the opportunity to go on virtual gimbal walks with their team, and I think that's anytime you can learn in an environment and see how something's applied outside of your environment actually kind of helps frame up for you about how to think about it when it gets back to your environment. I think that's just really powerful.
I agree.
Well, I know that your favorite book right now is probably The Facade of Excellence, and I want you to talk about your book here in a minute, but I'm always curious about what authors are reading. So if you had a favorite book, author, or mentor that you could recommend to our listeners, who would it be?
Well, I thought about that, and of course, there's several really good books out there that are current. But uh, whenever I had a team of people working for me, I would give them right at the beginning of their career 3 books. So I wanted to highlight those 3 books. And so we're going old school. Of course, the first book I would give them is The Goal. The goal is kind of the breakthrough foundation of what lean is really all about. When you talk about, throughput and capacity planning and understanding where bottlenecks are, that's a key book to learn from. The second book that I grew up on was what I mentioned this before, the Team Handbook by Brian Joyner. In fact, it's now been turned into one of the little memory jogger books. So you can find that online pretty easily. And then the third one, and I always put an asterisk next to this one because it is a very difficult book to read, but it is full of great gems of knowledge, and that's Out of the Crisis by Dr. Deming. That's where he introduces the 14 points, and he goes through what those points are and in a lot of depth. It's one of the first places where you see a process map for the first time. So it like I said, it's a bit old school, and it's tough to read through. I mean, you really have to force yourself to get through the book because it can be difficult. But I would always, every time a new employee came in to work for me, I would hand them those 3 books and say, you've got a week, read these, and then we'll discuss them.
Wow, to get through those 3 books in 1 week, that's impressive, right? I have the Kindle version of Out of the Crisis, and I try to make sure that I read that at least once a year at some point. It's just, it does get easier to read after you've read it the first time. It's
Right.
it's easier to review than it is to read. But for folks that maybe are a little shy, I would absolutely ask you to Google Deming's 14 points and at least grab that piece just to get a taste of the really profound learning that Dr. Deming is trying to pass along with Out of the Crisis. Great book. Can you talk to us about the Facade of Excellence for a few minutes? Like, what can readers expect when they pick up that book, John?
So, and actually, this is a lot of what we've been discussing is why I wrote the Facade of Excellence. And before reading the book, I always encourage people to look up Dr. Deming's 14 points, because interwoven throughout the chapters, you'll find either direct or indirect references to those points. So the first of all, the way the book is written is a little different than what people might be accustomed to. And I mentioned earlier the goal. People have compared it to that type of style. So each chapter is half narrative of a story that follows 2 executives that have both been challenged to achieve excellence. One wants to do it the right way. His name's Jim Brown, and he inherits a staff that doesn't want to change. He's new to the company, so he has to first figure out how to win them over before he can start winning the employees over. And then you have another executive. His name is Frank Smith, and he does everything the wrong way. So he uses fear. He manipulates data. He, is the ultimate firefighter. He controls his people to the nth degree. He even gets to the point where he actually lies about the data, fudges the data, anything to make it look like they're winning and to make himself look good. So the narrative is all based on actual events that have happened throughout my career. There's one point in the story where one of the operators is told by Frank Smith, the bad guy, to his machine keeps jamming because they just went to a new supplier. That the reason they went to this new supplier was to get a better price on the parts. Well, the parts don't fit and don't work well in the machine, and he's told to just suck it up, and he's given a stick to reach through the guarding to unjam the parts on a regular basis. And of course, some things go wrong, and
Bad things happen.
Yeah, bad things happen, right? Well, actually, I talked to you. That was me. I was, when I was at GE. I was at in a plant where we had a machine that was acting up, and instead of actually, and it was because of a part we got from a new supplier that wasn't working well, and I was told to
Suck it
stand
up.
by the machine and use a stick to unjam the parts. And so every story in the narrative is real. Just change the names, change the circumstances to protect some of the identities. And then the second half of each chapter is basically how to take what you learn in the story part and apply it to your organization to make it real. So the and of course, there's a few twists in the story. Again, all things that have happened in my career. At one point in the story, though, the narrative shifts from these two executives down to one of the operators. Her name's Mary, and she's my favorite character in the entire book. And of course, she is jaded from the beginning, doesn't trust management. They finally win her over. She finally becomes a champion and is very excited about all this. And then a change is made, a new person gets brought in, and it all goes back to the old ways of command and control. And there's one particular part in the book where, and I've had several operators tell me this, she says, boy, I wish that we had never been exposed to this whole idea of working as a team, because now I know how great that could have been. And now the rug's been yanked from underneath me, and I feel even worse about my job now than I did before.
Once you work in an environment where you have the ability to raise your hand and pull the andon cord, or you have the ability to raise your hand and suggest an improvement, you never ever want to go back to an environment where you don't have that ability to share. I mean, it's human nature. It's once you experience it, you never want to go back, and that's so true.
That's exactly
For
right.
the audio listeners to the podcast, and you heard that story about the poking the stick. You didn't get a chance to see my facial reaction when he had that. I can tell you that John has been waving his hands. He has all 5 digits on each hand. We're good. There, nothing catastrophic happened there. No fingers were lost in the telling of the story. Unfortunately, that's not always the output when someone's told to go around safety measures with a machine.
That's exactly right.
John, now that we know that you can fully hold a magic wand in your hand, either hand, you and I both know that magic wands don't exist. But if they did, and you could fix anything with a group or a facility that you were coaching, what would you typically try and fix first?
Yeah, I would. Actually, it's kind of interesting, because the first thing that I would want to fix is the metrics, that drive the behaviors. When you really look at the root cause of why leaders behave the way they do, and this can be traced all the way back to the early 1900s, back in the beginning of the Industrial Revolution. It's what drives their behavior is what they're being measured on, what and how their bonus is structured, and who gets promoted and how they get promoted. And if the organization's not willing to take a look at those metrics and say, why do we measure things this particular way, then don't expect any differences in behavior, right? So one of my biggest pet peeves is a metric called employee utilization. Employee utilization, again, back when employees were looked at as assets, that was a measurement to say, are we getting all the bang for the buck for every employee that we hire? Not taking into account that they have a brain, they can actually think, they can actually be a part of a team, they can actually improve things. But if you think about it, if employee utilization is still a key metric in a manufacturing organization, they'll never be lean. It's impossible. So if the company is not willing to address that particular metric, then don't be surprised when the rest of it never seems to work. So that's what I would do with my magic wand is say, hey, we need to change all of the metrics and what defines a successful leader.
Great advice. I actually had Nick Katko on recently from BMA talking about lean accounting, and he talks about if you want results, you have to change the way you measure things, and that's just that magic wand moment echoes that sentiment. So,
But
John, how can people connect with you if they want to learn more about what you do, or if they have a question for you?
so I'm on LinkedIn. They can look me up there, and I'd be happy to connect to whoever wants to connect. I'm also on Twitter. You can find me at John Dyer PI, PI standing for Process Innovation. And then, or you can go to the IndustryWeek.com website and search John Dyer, and they actually have a web page with my bio and all the articles that I've written for them. And there's some links in there that will take you to my LinkedIn page, and it has my email and that sort of thing. So IndustryWeek.com and search John, Dyer.
All right. So, John, we've got everything here, and that's great. One thing I want to highlight is something that you told me in our pre-interview. You're going to be the textbook for an inaugural book club. Can you tell folks about that book club and who's sponsoring it and what they can expect?
Yeah, like I mentioned to you in the pre-interview, it's been tough to launch a book in COVID times. You're not allowed to do many book signings when you can't interact with people. So it's been tough to get traction with my book, but it's starting to gain some momentum. So AME, the organization I mentioned just a little bit ago that has over 4,000 members, they've decided to start a book club in February, and they chose my book to be the inaugural book that they're going to be using. So I'm excited about that. And if you want to join in, there'll be some Q&A with the author and some discussion opportunities throughout the month of February. You can go to ame.com or their webpage, Google, AME. And one of the events is Book Club with John Dyer in February, and you can, sign up for it there. The other one that's kind of interesting, and I've actually had a couple of professors at universities tell me this, but I finally got one that's putting it into practice, and she has decided to use my book as the textbook for a course she's teaching in the spring at the University of California in Riverside. And I'm excited to hear how that goes. So she's going to give me some feedback on how the students respond to the Facade of Excellence.
Well, John, thank you for your contributions to the lean and continuous improvement community. Thank you for taking time to be a guest on the podcast here today and share your stories. I'm grateful for what you're doing, and I'd love to have you back as a guest sometime.
I'd be glad to come back. Thank you for the opportunity.
All right. Thanks, John. I want to thank John for being a guest on the podcast today. I hope you got a lot out of our conversation. I know that I did. Be sure to go to the show notes page at leanleadershippodcast.com and check out the links to learn more about John or how to connect with him if you have a question about what we talked about today. As always, I welcome your feedback on how to improve the podcast. If you like the podcast, make sure to go to podchaser.com/Lean Leadership Podcast and leave a rating for the podcast or leave a review. Thank you for listening, and until next time, seek progress over perfection.